everyone, I hope you've had a great weekend. Welcome to our first online module, the topic of which is conversation analysis. The best way to go through this presentation is to have your course text nearby so you can refer to it as I discuss examples and concepts from Chapter 5. As you know, from our chapter, conversation analysis comes from sociology, and CA researchers are interested in how people manage their everyday conversational interactions and how social relations are developed through the use of spoken discourse. In our first mini-analysis, you had some experience transcribing talk, and most of you opted for a broad system of transcription where you didn't try to illustrate a lot of the detail that can be found in conversation, which was fine. And now we're going to see how, if we wanted to apply CA tools and this method, we could look at conversation in much more detail, dependent upon our research questions and the goals of our research. So CA is basically a fine-grained analysis of spoken discourse, which helps not just describe the social world, but understand how, through the use of language, it's actually constructed. CA researchers avoid starting with assumptions or approaching the research with biases from the outset. This is important for all types of qualitative research to some degree, but it's particularly important for CA. And the researchers look for regularly occurring phenomena when they're transcribing talk. So the steps involved are making audio or video recordings, of course, to listen to and view for patterns. And we have an example from our other reading for this week from the ESL tutorial interactions article. And in this article, if you don't have it handy, that's fine. I just wanted to note that that's an example with video illustrating how you can capture the paralinguistic features of an interaction. And the author uses stills from the videos to illustrate certain points about how the tutor and tutee orient to each other and to the material, how they use gaze and body posturing. You could also look at facial expressions, hand gestures, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot to explore with video, but of course audio can be fine as well, depending on your interests. Then you would transcribe the entire recordings or key sections, select particular episodes to transcribe in more depth or detail, and finally, of course, you would report the research. Now let's look at some examples from our course text, and the first of these is from a popular American TV show called Sex and the City. If you haven't seen it, it doesn't matter. The content's not important to us right now. We're just interested in how Paltridge, in this chapter, has transcribed some talk from Sex and the City, and we can see how transcription conventions are used to transcribe and illustrate some of the aspects of that intimate type of conversation between close friends. So if you look at page 109, you'll see the conversation at the top and the transcription conventions just below it. And we can see that with these conventions, if we decided to use these, which come from the work of Jefferson, we could transcribe things like a shift into especially high pitch, which is indicated with the arrow, all caps to indicate especially loud sounds relative to the surrounding talk, a sound that's been prolonged, which we see there. We could use parentheses with a period in between to indicate a pause, a very short pause. We could also indicate longer pauses depending on the length of time and depending on whether or not the pause is important to us and meaningful in that particular interaction. And we can indicate stress and intonation. So you see here in the conversation, Charlotte, the first speaker, says, "You're getting engaged." So you see how that shift into especially high pitch is shown with the arrow. Carrie says, "I threw up, I saw the ring and I threw up. That's not normal." So you can see a pause indicated there. So this is just an example of some of the ways that you can use different types of transcription conventions, and you'll see in the studies that we read that there's more than one way to transcribe talk, even if you're including a high level of detail. So you can sort of pick and choose between different types of transcription conventions, but these Jeffersonian transcription conventions are very popular. If you take a look at page 111, our next example, we can see the typical pattern for American phone call openings. So researchers have looked at particular genres. This is from the work of Shegloff, and examined lots of examples of that particular genre to see what the conversational moves are. So if we look at this example of a typical American phone call opening, we can see that there's the ring, which is labeled as a summons or answer sequence. A recipient says hello. A caller says, "Hi, Ida." This is labeled as the identification or recognition sequence. And then we have, "Yeah, hi, this is Carla." "Hi, Carla." This is labeled as the greeting sequence. So we can see here that looking across lots and lots of examples of this genre, these would be the typical moves or components of this particular call opening that you could find again and again. So these are the types of patterns that we're talking about that can be uncovered or discovered in looking through lots and lots of representative examples. So we talked about gender previously, and I know that many of you are interested in that. One of the things I wanted to point out, which is useful from a CA perspective, is that gender, or things of this type in relation to identity, may come up and emerge in the talk and be oriented to by the people involved in the conversation. However, we may not expect to find something about gender from the outset. Instead, we look at it with the CA perspective as something that may or may not emerge. If it emerges, then it's relevant to us as the researchers. So you see in this example, they've actually coupled CA with membership categorization analysis, and we'll talk about that in the future. But for now, they're looking at gender noticing, or in the terms that we used in prior sessions to talk about gender, how people do gender. And so these were neighbor disputes, and you can see in the conversation between Edgar and Vernon at the bottom of the page on 120, Edgar says, "Well, she just flew at me." And the language, it was it was incredible for a lady. I mean, she's only a small old lady. Okay, so you can see how gender has been made relevant by the participant and how it's brought up again and again in the discussion. And so in that way we can say this is an aspect of identity that has been made relevant here. And we also, again, had our article example from tutoring as an embodied activity of ways that you can look at the visual aspects of the interaction, which can be very useful depending on what it is you're looking at. Another area of interest and term that's used in CA is turn-taking. And turn-taking refers to the organization of the distribution of opportunities to talk. In English, generally one person speaks at a time, and silence can be considered relevant or important depending on when it occurs. So there's an unmarked value of the transition space, which is 1 beat of silence, so one brief moment of silence that is possible after the completion of a turn, and then a next speaker ordinarily allows 1 beat of silence to pass before starting the next turn, and so on. Departures from that value are potentially marked and import laden. So this is the way that American English conversation typically functions, and silence plays different roles in different cultures, but in American English it can be taken as a rejection of or a disalignment from what preceded it. A number of factors can affect turn-taking. These include the topic of conversation, so whether you're talking about your favorite movie or an academic topic or something else, how cooperative an interaction may be, how well the speakers know each other. So it's of course different if you're speaking to your friends, people you've known all your life, versus people at work in a meeting, informal, formal settings, how well you know each other, if you're new colleagues or very close, the relationship between and the status of the speakers. So whether you're speaking to someone who has a position of authority or someone who is very close to you socially, and these kinds of things. All of these things can affect turn-taking. Another term that's used in conversation analysis research is repair. Repair refers to when speakers display that they're dealing with trouble or they have problems in speaking, hearing, or understanding the talk. So speakers can correct things that have been said and check what they have understood. This may be a fact or grammar, or in relation to searching for a word or replacing a word with another term. Self-repair and other repair are the two types of repair, and self-repair is generally more common. Again, in terms of terminology, the term adjacency pairs is used in CA to describe utterances that are produced by two successive speakers. The second utterance is related to the first as an expected follow-up. So some examples of this would be how a request is usually followed by either an acceptance or a refusal. Similarly, an offer would be followed by an acceptance or a refusal, and a question would be followed by an expected answer or an unexpected answer or non-answer. Refusals are usually longer, maybe more delayed, and more complex than acceptances because they are face-threatening. We had a funny example in our text, maybe familiar to us, on page 117. And in this example, in terms of preferred and dispreferred responses, we had someone asking, "Are you going out with anyone at the moment?" This is the question. And then we have speaker B, there's a delay. And then, "Well, kind of. There is someone I met a while back. Actually, I'm getting married at the end of the year." So then we have our unexpected answer to this question. So this is just an example of how these adjacency pairs can operate. And we also had an example in terms of looking at cross-cultural interactions with the French and English speakers. So if you have the text handy on page 116, there was an example, a cross-cultural example, where the French workers often responded to the everyday greeting, "Did you have a good weekend?" by stopping and telling the English workers all about their weekend. The English-speaking workers were irritated by this and did not realize that a French speaker would not ask that question if they did not want a real and complete answer. They didn't realize that this is not a typical question French speakers would ask each other in everyday conversational situations. So we have an example here of a mismatch because of different cultural expectations. This is another thing that you could examine in this type of research. Okay, so what concerns us as people who are doing educational research in L2 settings? How could CA be of interest to us? Well, some of the things we might look at are issues of how talk in educational context is organized. If you guys remember, we talked about teacher to student versus student to student interactions. We talked about the IRE or IRF pattern of interaction. Interesting aspects might be who asks questions, who nominates a speaker to talk in an educational context. Do students nominate other students? Is it just teacher to student? That kind of thing. How particular goal-oriented actions are accomplished through this talk, and ways that this talk differs from ordinary conversation or talk in other educational contexts. These are some of the things we might explore. We may also be interested in different tasks in classroom activities, in classroom sessions, and how learners collaborate, or from an SLA perspective, how they might negotiate meaning in interactions. There have been other types of studies that look at things like the structure of participation by students in a bilingual elementary school classroom, the functions of particular teacher question types in ESL writing conferences, studies on how instructional design affects the ways in which students' talk develops, and this was done in a Japanese language classroom, combining talk and gesture in order to facilitate small group interaction in an EFL class. Other contexts such as physics contexts have been explored, Language Institute front desk encounters. So that's an educational setting, but it's a different type of interaction within that context, and academic counseling sessions. So this is food for thought for your final projects. There are lots of other things that could be explored, but these are just some ideas about the research areas that have already been investigated to some extent. With any of the approaches that we look at and have looked at throughout the semester, it's important to acknowledge the criticisms. So every approach has its pros and cons, or its adherents and its critics. Some criticisms of CA are that CA practitioners do generally see their data or the transcripts of their conversations as the only data needed to explain and justify claims they make about the interactions. But some claim it's not possible to know how participants view the conversation without asking them. So CA researchers would say you shouldn't talk to the participants, you shouldn't interview, and so on. You don't need to collect other types of data. It's also not possible, this is what other critics have suggested, and also not possible for researchers to analyze a text without motivation, just looking at the text to see what's there without any preconceived notion of what this might be. So this is another issue. Can you really look at a text or text in an unbiased way? Is that actually possible as human beings, as researchers? So many researchers now suggest integrating different approaches, and many have. For example, an ethnographic approach for a richer picture of the interactions. So I'm curious to hear what you would think about this issue. Your